Okay, welcome to Lunch and Learn with our wonderfully small crowd. As far as housekeeping announcements go, hello, welcome. Come on in. Be in the back, so be sure to help yourself. Restroom right out the back door. And then if you are keeping track of when our next Lunch and Learns are. Usually we do second and fourth Tuesdays, but with all of the holidays in December, this will be the final Lunch and Learn this month. So we'll reconvene in January in the new year. So January 13th will be the next Lunch and Learn. And we have Craig Monahan, who will be talking lumbering history, which should be really great. And with 2026, we're going to be looking at that 250th anniversary of the United States. And so each month, we're going to have a special Lunch and Learn that ties in to the America 250 theme of power of place. And so we're going to do sort of a deep look at certain historical aspects of Saginaw itself and how it grew up and how it's related to who we are here. In just as a way of doing something a little different and special to acknowledge the 250th. So we can look forward to that next year, and that will kick off on the fourth Tuesday of January. And off the top of my head, I don't remember what that date is. Somebody can do the math. 13 plus 4. Okay, so I am Jennifer Vanette, and I serve as outreach coordinator here at the Castle Museum, and I also studied history for a really long time. And what I studied for my PhD dissertation is related to human rights history. And so I thought, since tomorrow is International Human Rights Day, and we'll talk about why that is. And then today is actually important to human rights history as well, because today is the 77th anniversary of the United Nations adopting the Genocide Convention, which we'll talk about that today too. And so kind of like a moment in time 77 years ago that sort of well, in some ways, we don't think it changes much because we still know, like later we see Rwanda, we see these major conflicts and genocides and things that happen, so we sort of downplay the role. But what we'll talk about today is how much that actually does change that moment 77 years ago with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention. It actually gives us language that didn't exist before, which is powerful. So those are the types of things we're going to talk about today. Come on in, we're just starting. Love it, the intrepid people who came out today. So one of the things that piqued my interest was the end of World War II. We have our big celebrations, yay, it's over. We've learned what's happening, or what has happened with the Holocaust, and we're starting our never again cries. But our historical memory, just like, to me, I had a lot of questions because you go through, I was studying something in the US actually, and I was realizing how much anti-Semitism is really prominent right after the war and right during that early Cold War period. And that is sort of what led me down this path towards looking at this aftermath moment, this aftermath of genocide, and what that actually meant for the world. It's not an uplifting story, because while the world is celebrating, yay, we've ended this major conflict, and they're starting to learn about what happened with the Holocaust. We like to skip it. We like to skip over it. We also don't talk about it very much. Think about all of the pop culture movies, even the ones that do a really good job of showing you how horrifying the Holocaust was. Something like Schindler's List, right? Really popular movie in terms of how many people saw it. Very poignant. But the camp is liberated, they start walking over a hill into the sunshine, and then it's present day, right? Think about any movie you've ever seen related to the Holocaust. How does it end? It ends with liberation. What happened next? Well, what happened next was Jews didn't have any place to go. Those who had been pushed into these concentration camps. There is still an amazing amount of anti-Semitism that is happening across Europe, it's happening in the US. So there's this what do we do moment among the Allies. And actually, what most people don't realize is once the World War was over and the concentration camps were liberated, because they didn't have any place to send people, all they did was move people from their barracks where they had been confined by the Nazis into the soldiers' barracks. They stayed there. They relabeled them displacement camps. So there's a lot of euphemisms that get layered on top of this, but they don't go anywhere because there's nowhere to go. Because the process of this started by stripping them of their property and their rights. They don't have homes to return to. Their neighbors don't want them back. Like, we don't talk about that part very much. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Jewish cemeteries are being desecrated. Synagogues are still being vandalized. There's not this moment of, oh, we lost the war and we were wrong. We should stop this behavior. That doesn't happen. So the Allies are trying to figure out what to do. But at the same time, one of the things they're trying to also figure out what to do is how to establish a new world order. How we're going to deal with these conflicts in a way, because if you recall, we had World War I, which was supposed to be the war to end all wars, and then not too long after, we have World War II. So clearly what we did after World War I didn't work. So what should we do? So there are plenty of conversations around that. But you have a group called the World Jewish Congress. Now, they're an umbrella organization, so they have affiliate groups from all different countries, and they have like an executive board that's like leading over their efforts. They formed their organization in 1936 because they see Hitler rising to power, and they say this is going to be bad for the Jewish community. We need to start figuring out how to work together. So Nahum Goldman is one of the most prominent Jewish leaders in Europe. Already in the 1930s, he will remain one of the most prominent world leaders. Rabbi Stephen Wise, sitting next to him, is one of the most prominent U.S. leaders. And Rabbi Wise is the head of the American Jewish Congress, which is affiliated to the World Jewish Congress. So this is how it works. It's like all of these organizations are doing their work with their leadership, but their leadership is sending members into the World Jewish Congress to work together. So they're starting in 36 because they're worried. By 1939, they're trying to figure out how to save Jewish lives. And they're going to work through the entire war like this, and they're going to come out of the war saying, this exposes a lot of problems we have around minority rights. Today we might use the term marginalized more regularly, but at the time, historically, they used the term minority. They were a minority population within a larger population. But Jews were interconnected, and they saw there is this connection, and there is something happening with the treatment of Jews broadly. So they're trying to work through these things, and then after the war, they really get to work on how to achieve restitution for what's been stolen, how to help Jews to immigrate to wherever they might be safe and be able to start a new life. I mean, here's the thing though, the US is not a pretty picture. During the war, we didn't increase our quotas to allow Jewish immigrants, and after the war, we actually restricted our quotas in a way that we knew would harm Jews from Eastern European countries. But we did it anyway, and we did it under the guise of saying we were worried about communism. So it's not a great picture, but I need to set this up because we tend to look at these nation states that created the UN and did all this work as kind of moral leaders in this moment after the war. And the reality is that they really weren't. And if you didn't have these groups like the World Jewish Congress or other non-governmental organizations or NGOs as we call them, if you don't have them as part of this, why does this keep hanging on? Probably. It's updating well, whatever. Okay, well, ta-da. Anyway, so if you don't have these NGOs working, then not much is actually going to happen in terms of human rights. So that's kind of the heart of what I was studying. And all right, it's fine. I had a picture of Versailles, but it's a painting and you don't need it. It's okay. All right, so let's step back and figure out why we needed the United Nations in the first place, what had failed at the end of World War I. So there are a lot of things that failed there, but we'll focus, in terms of human rights, we'll just focus on that little portion. So what they did at Versailles in these agreements was they said that, okay, we will address minority rights. This was it was contentious to try to get that addressed at all, but they said they would. But what they did was every place that had a minority population within its country could set up its own treaty with that minority population. So there was no universal treaties, no universal agreements as to what needed to happen. Every single one was in isolation. But then minority groups had no standing at the League of Nations, so if they felt like they had a complaint to bring to the League of Nations, the only way they could do that was by getting the government to agree to bring their petition. Okay, so if it's the government you're under, they're not going to do that, right? So now you have to petition another government that's party to the League of Nations to bring your complaint forward. So as you can imagine, this hardly ever happened. It basically just never worked that way. But the bigger problem that becomes exposed is, and how weak these treaties are, is that once you have a war and a conflict, you will create refugees. You will create people who need to flee, and once they do that, they are no longer party to that nation state. They are no longer party then to that minority treaty, and they actually have no rights. They become stateless. And once you become stateless, under that current, at that time, international system, you had no rights at all. See why that's a problem? Especially as we're going through World War II with what happens to Jews. And this is going to be a major issue for the Jewish community because obviously the people are fleeing. After the war, I'll pick on Austria. Austria was one of the worst about this. So after the war, Austria said, well, you have no right to sue for your restitution of your property because you're not really Austrian. Austrians stayed. You left. So we won't accept you as Austrian. Okay, they fled because otherwise they would have been put in a concentration camp and murdered. So this whole situation really exposed how poorly conceived international law was in terms of any type of human rights. I did throw this in. This is a copy of the British Foreign Office report of the Holocaust itself. So what happened is that a World Jewish Congress representative, Gerhard Rigner, had an informant that told him what was coming. And he sent 2 telegrams because you have to have a backup. So he sent a telegram to Rabbi Stephen Wise in the US, and he sent a telegram to parliamentarian Sidney Silverman in the UK. And so this is the summary of it, but received alarming report stating that in the Fuhrer's headquarters, a plan has been discussed and is under consideration according to which all Jews in countries occupied or controlled by Germany, numbering 3.5 to 4 million, should, after deportation and concentration in the East, be at one blow exterminated in order to resolve once and for all the Jewish question in Europe. This is sent, so this, at the bottom of this one, this is the British one, please inform and consult New York. That means Stephen Wise. And his telegram said to inform and consult London. I don't know if you can see it, but the date on this is August 11th, 1942. When did World War II end? 1945. This is sent 3 years prior to the end of the war. It changed nothing in terms of how the Allies fought this war. So when we look at this culmination, this is why, in the aftermath, Jews are organized and persistent and forceful about what needs to change. So, there's my pretty Versailles picture. So, stateless. Minority rights are not a concern. They haven't been a concern. Now, during the war, and increasing as we get towards the end of the war, there are all these conferences held to figure out what should be next, because they all know the League of Nations didn't work. There needs to be something better. So they're already having these conversations, especially between the US and UK, but also the USSR and France. Depends on the conference who's there, right? But top dogs are the US, UK through this whole process. So anyway, we're gonna fast forward to April 26th through June 26th of 1945. The war is not over yet, but we're gathering now in San Francisco to hold the charter meeting of the United Nations. So at this point, there is confidence among the Allies that the war is nearing completion, and we're going to craft these documents. This is all these conferences and discussions. This is now the moment. So the US actually sends consultant groups from various minority groups and various other leaders in different labor groups and things like that that are all part of the US delegation. Other countries are sending the same type of thing. And they all are there trying to craft the charter for the UN, forming it in the first place. and agreements that they know are going to have to come after that. Think of it like the Constitutional Convention for the US, if you've studied that more. It's very similar to that. They're in committee groups hammering out the language of all of these different things. And the World Jewish Congress is there. Their representatives are there and making arguments about human rights and the necessity for human rights. Now, most of the groups are here saying, this is about world security and peace. And Jewish organizations are like, yes, and to get that, you have to protect human rights. And so they were fighting an uphill battle, actually. And again, remember that most people still don't know the implication of the Holocaust yet. This begins in April, and I might get the wrong camp, but I believe it's April, in mid-April is when Auschwitz is liberated. So the world as a whole doesn't actually understand. A concentration camp didn't necessarily equate to death. It was not good, but what happened under Nazism was a new thing, right? It was not what was expected. So people don't fully understand yet. But Rigner, right? We know that the World Jewish Congress knows, and they're telling everybody what is actually occurring. So we're at this, and they work out the structure of the UN. And I'm gonna play this. This is a little kind of PSA type video that went out to the US.
We all have to recognize, no matter how great our strength,
We hear it.
that we must deny ourselves the license to do always as we please. No one nation, no regional group can or should expect any special privilege which harms any other nation. If any nation would keep security for itself, it must be ready and willing to share security with all. That is the price which each nation will have to pay for world peace. Unless we are all willing to pay that price, no organization for world peace can accomplish its purpose. And what a reasonable price that is. Out of this conflict have come powerful military nations, now fully trained and equipped for war. But they have no right to dominate the world. It is rather the duty of these powerful nations to assume the responsibility for leadership toward world peace. That is why we have here resolved that power and strength shall be used not to wage war, but to keep the world at peace and free from the fear of war. By their own example, the strong nations of the world should lead the way to international justice. That principle of justice is the foundation stone of this charter. That principle is the guiding spirit by which it must be carried out. Not by words alone, but by continuous concrete acts of goodwill. Now there's a time for making plans, and there's a time for action. The time for action is here now. Let us, therefore, each in his own nation and according to its own way, seek immediate approval of this charter and make it a living thing.
So, you can tell from that where their priorities are. It's about security. It's about checking the power of each other, keeping everybody honest, we'll say. How about that? But one of the things, so the World Jewish Congress wanted there to be a human rights agreement attached to the charter. They don't get that out of this meeting. But they do get language added into the charter that says that one of the purposes of the UN is to achieve international cooperation in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Sounds good, but what does that mean? And the reality is, in 1945, they didn't know what that meant. Okay? So I haven't seen the movie yet. Nuremberg just came out. And I don't know how well they're handling it. But one of the problems at Nuremberg that they had was language. How do you describe the atrocities of these crimes? Because it's murder, but it's not just murder. It's more than murder. But they would say, like, crimes against humanity. Okay, maybe. Acts of barbarity, most certainly. But that can mean many things. And so they struggled. They were really struggling with what that meant. And then they were also struggling with what freedoms they were talking about in all of this. Some people said it was Roosevelt's 4 freedoms. But other people said, well, no, there's been more conversation since then. And Roosevelt's 4 freedoms are still super vague. We don't know what they mean either. So there's this conversation that's already begun at the UN Charter meeting, but they can't make that happen just yet. So there's going to be a full, that's okay. So there's going to be a full structure put in place, and you don't have to know all of this, but I just want you to see that it's kind of complicated. You have the General Assembly, you have a Security Council, you also have an Economic and Social Council. The Secretariat is overseeing these things. There's also going to be an International Court of Justice that actually will be solidified a little bit later than this moment. The Economic and Social Council is pretty much where these commissions are going to land that are going to address human rights stuff. But if you look under the Commission for Human Rights is actually technically under the General Assembly. So it's all just a little confusing. You don't have to actually know all this. Economic and Social Council is often abbreviated to ECOSOC, which I will probably end up saying as we go forward, and that's what I mean if I do that. So San Francisco happens. They set up an interim headquarters in Lake Success, New York. If you've ever been like, where the heck is that? It's on Long Island. I'm like a map person. I just like to know where I'm oriented. But it is always supposed to be an interim space while they sort out headquarters. And even still today, sometimes the General Assembly doesn't meet just in New York. They do meet in other places. We're going to see that take place. But here you go. Here's a commission meeting. One of the things that's really interesting is at the time, as they had headlines to give to the press, they actually wrote them on a chalkboard in the press area. And indeed, when they actually finalized the drafts of the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's actually at Lake Success, and they write it on there, and there's like one press person that's like, okay, it's not going to be important yet, but they're working on it. Now, we'll quickly talk about Genocide Convention, because again, the 77th anniversary of the adoption of that is today. 1948 in Paris, that is where the General Assembly convened at that moment. This man here is Raphael Lemkin. He's considered the father of genocide studies. He himself was Jewish. He looked at studying genocide throughout the world. And he was actually already producing some studies before what happens with the Holocaust occurs, but that also spurs his work forward. He recognized patterns and said, you don't just start with murdering people. There's actually a system in place that you first begin to dehumanize people. The goal of genocide is not murder. The goal of genocide is the eradication of a people. And you can do that in more ways than just murder. Murder is like end stage, but you're trying to strip them of language, religion, culture, everything that bonds them as a people. You're seeking to systematically destroy that. And he's writing about how this has occurred throughout history in many places. He said there had to be a word, right? Like Nuremberg's happening. There has to be a word that means this process, or we can't talk about it. How can we stop something that we can't even identify? So we have to identify the pattern. We have to have a word for it so everybody knows what we're talking about. And he was actually inspired by Kodak, of all things, because he said you needed a word that was memorable, easy to say, and it could mean nothing else. And he coined the term genocide. Genos from the Greek for people, and side from the Latin for killing or to kill. Genocide. People hated the word. It's so fascinating how much they were like, this is a terrible word. We need a better word. We can use his study, but like, why his word? It's kind of like, it's fun for the most part. It means the one thing. So here we have Dr. Evatt from Australia. He is signing at this moment. And a draft copy of it there, just, it's not that exciting to look at the paperwork. I tried to make these slides a little interesting. But Raphael Lemkin was not very politically savvy. Like, he knew what he was studying. He was so passionate and adamant that we had to put this language on it so that we could stop it and prevent it. The World Jewish Congress, they were very politically savvy. They had connections to world leaders, and they knew how to work those connections. So the World Jewish Congress is assisting with this crafting of the Genocide Convention, but they're also primarily working as the kind of lobbying firm to make this happen. Because guess who doesn't want to sign it? The US, the UK. It's not going to happen. So they have to figure out how to get smaller nations on board and adopt it anyway. So this actually is adopted without the US or the UK, but it comes into force because enough countries adopt and ratify it. This one has to be ratified, which would mean that the US government as a whole would have to say, like, we can't just have our representative, our ambassador to the UN can't just agree to it. A lot of things they can, but this had to be signed or ratified by our government. So that's not happening in this moment. So it's signed, much fanfare. People are extremely excited about this. The World Jewish Congress is most pleased with this because there's enforcement mechanism. There are agreements countries are making to say that if these patterns exist, they will step in for the security of those groups. That's why the US and the UK don't sign on. So what the US does sign on to and participates more heavily in is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is going to be signed one day after the Genocide Convention. So these things are working in tandem. The World Jewish Congress is working on helping craft these things behind the scenes. Oh, I forgot to mention, one of the reasons the World Jewish Congress is able to be in here is because during that charter meeting, it's sort of a little bit of chaos because nobody really knows what it can be yet. And they made the argument that one of the failures of the League of Nations was that minority voices had like no representation whatsoever. And so they created, the World Jewish Congress basically drafted agreements for consultant groups to the UN, and the UN adopts this. Labor organizations are at the highest tier. It has to do with like how many things you have expertise and direct involvement in, and so it's a tiered system. The World Jewish Congress is the first non-labor NGO to receive official consultant status, which means that they can draft memoranda, they can participate in committee meetings. The only thing they can't do is address ECOSOC and the General Assembly directly. They have to do that through somebody else. But all the committee meetings, all these drafting meetings, they're there. And they're submitting their own drafts and versions of these things for consideration. And their organization, so the Institute of Jewish Affairs, has this archive. And the writings that they did and the studies they did on this, the UN actually adopts as theirs. So it's not, I'm not just telling you they matter because they were there, but the UN says they matter. So with Eleanor Roosevelt becomes the chair of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights Committee, and becomes, you know, quite famous for this. Here's the perhaps most famous photo of this moment, holding the poster version of the Declaration after its adoption. Now, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does not have enforcement mechanisms in place. It is simply an agreement among nations to promote and respect these human rights. I don't like this photo because Eleanor Roosevelt makes me mad. I'm in good company because she also made W.E.B. Du Bois mad for the same reason. So Eleanor was a smart politician, but she knew that what was bothering US politicians was they were looking at the language being laid out in these human rights agreements and recognizing that their Jim Crow laws ran afoul of these. The American Bar Association was entirely flipped out. You can't sign on to these things because then we, like, our laws are contradictory, like, this is chaos, we can't do this. And they, of course, being the US in the 1940s, never occurred to anybody, maybe we should, you know, get rid of Jim Crow laws. No, they needed to not sign on to these international agreements that potentially put them at risk of already being in opposition to the newly created UN. So, Eleanor assured US politicians, assured the lawyers, this was fine because there's nobody to enforce it. We're just saying this is nice. And she worked to convince people to support this instead of supporting and adopting the Genocide Convention because the Genocide Convention was enforceable. So she gets a lot of credit for chairing that committee, but I have a lot of problems with her personally because she is partly responsible for why the US not never, but in this moment, does not adopt the Genocide Convention. But this is the moment where we do craft language around human rights and what they mean. And so it starts with a preamble, and then it describes, I'll tell you some of the rights that are in here. So it starts with saying everyone should be treated with dignity, entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration, regardless of race, sex, religion, nationality, property, or any other status. Other articles reject slavery, torture, protection from arbitrary arrest. They provide for fair and public hearings. They offer the presumption of innocence until guilt is proven. So some of these things are very compatible with US law already. Article 12 is right to privacy. 13 and 14 address the right to free movement within countries and the right to seek asylum. Article 14 says the person's has a right to enjoy asylum, but the World Jewish Congress is a little worried about this one not being forceful enough, but it does say that refugees cannot automatically be extradited back to the country where their persecution occurred. So even if they weren't going to be given asylum, that nation did not have the right to just send them straight back, is what it says. So other ones, you cannot be arbitrarily deprived of your nationality or the right to change your nationality. And this, of course, we talked about why that would be important to Jews who had fled. And then they go on to define other civic freedoms, including protection of marriage, that marriage has to be entered into only by the consent of both parties, the right to choose to dissolve your marriage, rights to property, freedom of expression and conscience, economic and social cultural freedoms, such as the freedom to assembly, rights to work, rights to receive equal pay, to form unions, the right to have rest and leisure is part of it, and the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to participate in cultural life of a community and share scientific advantages. One of the most contentious articles is actually 26, which is the right to an education. This had people up in arms for various reasons, but one of the reasons even Eleanor Roosevelt objected to this one was because it says that education shall be directed to the full development of human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Eleanor said that's indoctrination. Those who argued for this, including Renee Cusson, who was very important to this process, it's like, that's just basic. Like, if we're not going to say that you have to teach these human rights, then what are we even teaching? That does end up staying in, but that is because smaller nations, World Jewish Congress was part of aligning these groups and getting agreement. Egypt and Lebanon, for example, signed on. Lots of smaller groups pushed to make this happen. Now, what ends up happening then because of that article is then you have UNESCO, which is that educational programming from the UN, and that is what comes out of having left that in. But that's still really contentious, and even in the US throughout the 1950s, there was a lot of claims that UNESCO was indoctrination. So this charge doesn't go away, but it does stay in there. I don't remember, oh, that's just the current UN, sorry. Okay, so those are some of the freedoms that they articulate. So at this point, we now have a language, but the major thing, and the reason I think that we end up celebrating the anniversary of this declaration is because it becomes the foundation for all of our human rights covenants that do have enforcement. It is the foundation of our international human rights law. So this document by itself, as it stood, maybe wouldn't deserve the same fanfare of like the recognition of that anniversary day. But because of what it becomes, because it's this foundational moment, and we shouldn't discount how important having language is, because you can't solve a problem that you can't talk about. So it matters greatly, and so this ends up being what we celebrate every year on December 10th. I didn't really have a major reason for throwing in the UN headquarters in New York City other than it's kind of a cool building. So, so I went ahead and included that there. So what I learned through the process that kind of ended up disappointing me was that, you know, I grew up with all the stories about World War II and the Allies and what they did, and it seemed like this moral moment. And and studying it deeper, I had to learn that it really wasn't these political leaders that were the true leaders in a moral sense. That it did take these NGOs, not just the World Jewish Congress, they were just my main lens that I was using in this research, but these non-governmental organizations don't always get the credit they deserve. They're in the background, but extraordinarily important and powerful movers of this process. The United States eventually does adopt the Genocide Convention in 1988. So the Genocide Convention was in full force. It didn't really matter that we were a party to the UN, so we were subject to it anyway. But so it's kind of symbolic that we finally ratified it in 1988. In recent years, even as I was working on finishing this dissertation, which was interesting, we had both the US and the UK leaders questioning how firmly they wanted to support these agreements. So they're not set in stone. Just like our own constitution, there are things that are going to perpetually be negotiated if we want to keep them. So that is what I have for you. Any questions? Okay, yeah.
So our treatment of the American Indian would be considered genocide.
Yes, by Raphael Lemkin's definition, yes, it is. The US does not acknowledge that, though. Doesn't apply that. The US government has yet to apply that term. But Raphael Lemkin's study clearly lays out that it is. Yeah. Because the goal was to essentially erase them culturally, right? So, I mean, there are moments of murder, but think about the Indian boarding schools and the things like that where you're trying to like fully eradicate language, traditions, family ties. That is all part of the process. Anytime you hear dehumanizing language, it should kind of send up that spidey sense that this perhaps has genocidal undertones. Because most things start with dehumanizing language, especially when you hear, whenever you hear political authorities in particular compare humans to animals, use terms like infestations, things like that. The purpose of that language is to dehumanize so that it's easier to isolate them, because people stop thinking of people as fully human when we stop applying fully human language to them. And that's part of this process towards genocide that Raphael Lemkin like lays out in his studies. So whenever, like, that's just one of those things. If you think about Rwanda, right, there's a very clear, very fast. It's not hard to study it because it happens so quickly, but it starts with that dehumanizing language, especially comparing to vermin and insects and things, and that it's kind of like a grooming type thing to change your thinking where they're not human to you anymore. It's a lot easier to harm somebody that you don't see as human. So that's why that was one step that Lemkin really was concerned about as a clear sign towards where things can go if you don't stop it. And we saw that with Native Americans too. Same language. So I know this isn't like super exciting. My fellow grad students kind of teased me about being the depressing one all the time. But I mean, I think it's important, and I do think, but to me, like, that really cool aspect is, like, I don't think we give language enough credit. We talk about action a lot, even Truman's little, like, it's now the time for action. But the reality was their actions were words. Like, things happen because of words. Things happen because of language. And this horrific aftermath moment of the Holocaust literally changed our language and changed how we can even communicate about things that we value and our humanity. Like, to me, that is really cool. And it is like the happy, hopeful, the reason we celebrate International Human Rights Day, you know? Is that a better note to leave on? I know. All right, well. Okay, the heater has something to say apparently. I mean, if we don't have any more questions, then I guess we'll call it.